The story of British colonial history is one of the most significant and complex narratives in the modern world, woven through centuries of expansion, conquest, exploitation, and cultural exchange. It's a tale that begins in the late 16th century and spans over 4 centuries, covering a vast geographical area that stretched across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. At its height, the British Empire was the largest empire in history, controlling nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. But the story of British colonialism is not just about the expansion of territories, it is also a story about the profound and often devastating impact on the societies, economies, and cultures of the colonized regions. The origins of British colonialism. British colonial ambitions began in the late 16th century, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Inspired by the wealth flowing into Spain and Portugal from their overseas empires, England sought to establish its own colonies. The first successful English settlement was in North America, with the founding of Jamestown in 1607. The Virginia Company, a joint stock company, was granted a charter by the English Crown to establish colonies in the New World, marking the beginning of British colonization in North America. This early phase of colonialism was motivated by the desire for new trade routes, resources, and the spread of Protestantism. The 17th century saw the expansion of British colonialism in the Caribbean, with the establishment of sugar plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and other islands. These colonies became highly profitable, largely due to the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans, who were forcibly brought to work on the plantations. The transatlantic slave trade became a cornerstone of British colonial economy, fueling the growth of wealth and power in Britain while inflicting immense suffering on millions of Africans. The expansion of empire in the 18th century. The 18th century marked a period of aggressive expansion for the British Empire. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was a turning point, as Britain emerged victorious against France and gained control of vast territories in North America and India. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, saw Britain acquire Canada and the eastern half of the Mississippi Valley from France, as well as Florida from Spain. This victory solidified Britain's dominance in North America and laid the foundation for further expansion. In India, the British East India Company played a pivotal role in the expansion of British influence. Initially established as a trading company, the East India Company gradually took control of large parts of India through a combination of military force and political manipulation. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was a decisive moment, as the company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. This victory marked the beginning of British political control in India, which would eventually lead to the establishment of British rule over the entire subcontinent. The British Empire's expansion in the 18th century was also marked by the colonization of Australia and New Zealand. Captain James Cook's voyages in the Pacific led to the British claim over these territories, which were initially used as penal colonies. The settlement of Australia began in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet, and over the next century, British settlers would displace the indigenous populations, leading to the establishment of a settler colony. The height of the British Empire in the 19th century. The 19th century was the zenith of the British Empire, often referred to as the Imperial Century. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into the world's leading economic power, and this newfound wealth and technological prowess fueled further imperial expansion. The British Empire became a global network, with colonies in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific, connected by trade routes and protected by the Royal Navy. One of the most significant developments of this period was the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. Driven by economic interests, national rivalry, and a belief in the civilizing mission of empire, European powers, including Britain, carved up the African continent into colonies. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized this process, with Britain gaining control of vast territories, including Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. British colonial rule in Africa was characterized by economic exploitation, the imposition of European culture and political systems, and often brutal repression of resistance. In India, British control was formalized with the establishment of direct rule following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The British Crown took over from the East India Company, and Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1876. British rule in India was marked by the exploitation of India's resources for the benefit of Britain, leading to economic hardships for the Indian population. However, it was also a period of significant infrastructural development, with the construction of railways, telegraphs, and the establishment of a modern educational system. This paradoxical legacy of British rule in India has left a lasting impact on the subcontinent. The decline and fall of the British Empire. The decline of the British Empire began in the early 20th century, accelerated by the two world wars. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, strained Britain's resources and weakened its global influence. The interwar period saw the rise of nationalist movements in many colonies, demanding independence and self-determination. In India, leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru spearheaded the struggle for independence through non-violent resistance and political mobilization. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, further weakened the British Empire. Britain's war effort relied heavily on the resources and manpower of its colonies, but the war also exposed the contradictions and weaknesses of imperial rule. The economic devastation caused by the war, combined with the growing pressure from nationalist movements, made it increasingly difficult for Britain to maintain control over its colonies. The process of decolonization began in earnest after the Second World War. India gained independence in 1947, followed by the partition of India and Pakistan, which was marked by widespread violence and mass migration. The independence of India was a turning point, signaling the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Over the next 2 decades, most of Britain's colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean gained independence, often through negotiated settlements, but sometimes through armed struggle. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a symbolic end to Britain's role as a global superpower. The crisis, in which Britain attempted to seize control of the Suez Canal from Egypt, ended in a humiliating defeat, exposing Britain's diminished influence on the world stage. The following decades saw the gradual dismantling of the remaining parts of the British Empire, with the transfer of Hong Kong to China in 1997 often cited as the final chapter in the history of British colonialism. The legacy of British colonialism. The legacy of British colonialism is deeply complex and continues to shape the world today. On one hand, the British Empire left behind significant infrastructural and administrative systems, such as the legal frameworks, educational institutions, and transportation networks, in many former colonies. English became a global lingua franca, facilitating communication and trade across diverse regions. The spread of democratic ideals and parliamentary systems in former colonies is often cited as a positive legacy of British rule. However, the negative impacts of British colonialism are profound and far-reaching. The economic exploitation of colonies drained resources and wealth from the colonized regions, leading to underdevelopment and poverty that persist to this day. The arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers have led to ongoing conflicts and ethnic tensions in many parts of the world. The cultural imposition of British values and the erasure of indigenous traditions have had lasting effects on the identities and social structures of colonized peoples. In addition to these material and cultural legacies, the British Empire's history is marked by violence and oppression. The transatlantic slave trade, the brutal suppression of rebellions, the exploitation of labor, and the imposition of foreign rule left deep scars on the societies that were colonized. The struggle for independence in many colonies was often met with violent repression, leaving a legacy of trauma and resistance. Understanding British colonial history. Understanding British colonial history is crucial for making sense of the modern world. The legacy of the British Empire continues to influence global politics, economics, and culture. The complex and often contradictory impacts of colonialism are still felt in the former colonies, where the struggle for development, identity, and justice continues. For Britain, too, the legacy of empire is a source of ongoing debate and reflection, as the country grapples with its imperial past and its place in the world today. The history of British colonialism is not just a story of power and domination, it is also a story of resistance, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. The people who lived under British rule, whether in India, Africa, the Caribbean, or elsewhere, played an active role in shaping their own histories, resisting oppression, and fighting for their rights and freedoms. Their stories are an essential part of the narrative of British colonial history, reminding us that the legacy of empire is not just one of conquest and exploitation, but also of struggle and liberation. As we reflect on this history, it is important to recognize the complexities and contradictions of the British Empire, to understand its profound impact on the world, and to learn from its legacies as we navigate the challenges of the present and future.